Hi, and welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is entitled Inferior Data Part 2. Specifically, we'll be looking at two topics, relative risk and power, and the dangers of extrapolation. This picks up where we left off in the last class, which was asking and trying to answer the question, can we gain causal knowledge through means other than conducting randomized controlled trials, or RCTs for short? That is, if RCTs are the gold standard for how we acquire causal knowledge, is there a silver standard, or a bronze standard, or a copper standard, or is there only the gold standard? So what we're looking at today is continuing the topic first of power and trying to understand the concept of power by speaking about relative risk ratios. The second thing we're going to talk about again is the dangers of extrapolation and how that can skew studies that are not based in randomized controlled trials, or potentially even for randomized controlled trials that are only narrowly constructed. Let's get started. Remember in the last class I ended with a slide that said the following, that not all causal relationships are strong. We need more scientific power in order to discover medium or weak causal relationships. What I meant by that was that often the manipulation of a suspected stimulus does not result in nearly so dramatic a difference in the effect. In such instances where the causal relationship is weaker, that is, that we're only looking at some sort of nuanced, minor causal effects, such as was the case for heart attacks and the use of aspirin, where only a 5% differential occurred between using aspirin and not in the incidence of heart attacks, you have to do a more careful experiment with more controls and more randomization in order to get that causal knowledge than, say, in the case of noticing that malaria is effectively treated by DDT, where the causal results are so stark and convincing and so powerful that we don't actually necessarily need very high-powered, well-controlled, randomized trials in order to get that causal knowledge. To understand this idea of power better than what we have so far, I want to turn to a concept of what's called relative risk. Relative risk says that in any study we should compare a group of exposed individuals or manipulated individuals, people subject to the treatment or the concept or the risk or whatever it is that you want to think of, and then another group of control subjects that are not exposed to the same. And then look and see what's the difference in ratio between the number of people who have a certain outcome or effect in the exposed group versus a number of people who are affected in a control group. Then we can figure out whatever that differential is between the number of people in the exposed group and the number of people in the control group is probably attributable to the risk or to the cause, if in fact that's really the only difference between these two groups. Of course, again, randomization helps us to assure that in fact we're only dealing with one specific factor or variable. But even for circumstances where we haven't randomized, relative risk ratios might help us see whether in fact cause exists. Let's take a couple of examples. Here I've drawn a chart where on the top part of that fraction bar you see a group of 10 dots, 8 red, 2 green. And likewise below in a control group you see 10 dots, 8 red, 2 green. What I'm going to suggest is, let's say I randomized a group of people and I took 20 people and put 8 reds and 2 greens in one group and 8 reds and 2 greens in another. That is, I just randomized and said, for example, if we were talking about cancers here, that there's about 4 cancers out of every 20 in the population. That's actually about true. So if this were cancers we were speaking of, and I randomized the population into these two groups, we might expect approximately 2 cancers per every 10. But what if we say that a chemical treatment results in the exposure group, and you'll see it here marked by a plus green, 1 additional cancer? Then we would divide these ratios, 3 out of 10 by 2 out of 10, and you would therefore get the number 1.5, which we call the relative risk. This tells us the risk increase, 150% or 1.5, of having cancer in the exposed group as opposed to the control group. Do you see why? Because there was one additional cancer, the one marked with the plus in the green circle. I can take it away if you want and put it back again. As opposed to the control group, where we would not expect that additional cancer or condition, whatever it is we're talking about, heart attacks, terrorist attacks, doesn't really matter. And so the point being is we wouldn't expect it in the control group because it wouldn't have shown up there. Therefore, we say the relative risk in this exposure is 1.5. I could do this again, and here I'm going to draw out 1, 2, and here's a cute little fading arrow, 3 exposed incidences of this. Okay, let me say I have another example here where again we have 10 in an exposed group as our subjects and 10 in our control group. And again, just as before, when we randomize, we expect relatively the same number of effects in the control and the exposed group without any sort of treatment beforehand. The background rate, in other words. 2 cancers out of 10 in the exposed group for reasons other than the exposure, and 2 out of 10 in the control group where there's no exposure. What I'm going to suggest is the relative risk ratio could of course be higher than 1.5 as was in the last example. Let's say that in this case, because of the exposure, it's not 1 additional incidence of cancer or terrorist attack or what have you, but 4 additional ones. Watch. 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the exposed group now have an exposure and also contract the effect that we're looking at. Cancer, terrorist attacks, horse tramplings, alien abductions, whatever it is we want to talk about. Here, we would say 6 out of 10 in the exposed group have suffered the harm, and only 2 out of 10 in the control group have. If we divide those two fractions, we end up with the number 3, which is the relative risk ratio. There's a 300% increase over the background rate of whatever the risk is in the exposed group. So 1, 2, 3, 4 additional cases out of 10, plus the 2 background, divided by the background rate, gives us 3. Look through these slides again if you don't quite get it, but in both these examples you should see a relative risk calculation. What does relative risk do for us? Well, in some ways it's a measure of statistical power. It tells us how strong the relationship is if we simply divide up the population and expose one group to a certain risk and not the other. And so this can be done not just in the case of heart attacks, where we had a 1.31 relative risk if we went back and look at Peto's study from a few classes back, but we could also do it for things like malaria. And there, for example, I believe it was in Burma, the contracted difference was 70% prior to the DDT ban, prior to the introduction of DDT having that, versus only 5% having it after DDT was introduced. So the relative risk of contracting malaria as a result of not having DDT available to control the malaria was a 14-fold risk increase over the background rate where DDT was used. In the second case, we have so much more statistical power, 14 being a huge relative risk increase, that in fact we can be fairly confident that there is a causal relationship even if we didn't have a randomized separation of controlled and exposed populations. Contrast that with the case of heart attacks and aspirin usage. A 1.31 relative risk increase is not that great. Generally, a rule of thumb when I've talked to different scientists about this is that 2.0 is kind of the cutoff for relative risk before scientists feel comfortable claiming a causal relationship. That's not a hard number, it's just kind of a consensus number. 1.31 obviously was sufficient in the case of aspirin, and as we'll see in a minute, that was a sufficient relative risk increase partly because so many people were enrolled in the study and because the study design was an RCT, which made it a gold standard kind of study, so you didn't need to hit the 2.0 risk ratio in order to be able to show causation in this case. But where it's as high as 14 and you do have some sort of funny confounder that you're obviously aware of, that's a fairly good indication, at least as an initial cut at the question, that something's going on that's worth looking at further. Here's, for example, a list of cigarette smoking relative risk ratios. The right-hand column in this chart, don't worry about the other things in there unless you want to look it through, but the relative death rate is totaled for all forms of deaths from cigarette smoking, a 1.57 risk increase over the background. But then here are the relative risks for specific forms of disease in smokers as opposed to in non-smokers. Now notice, this is not a randomized study. We didn't force people to smoke or not to smoke and then study the effects on them. So it wasn't an RCT. But in looking at observational studies of them, we saw that certain relative risk ratios were higher for smokers than for non-smokers for certain forms of ailments. For example, we saw for coronary artery disease a 1.7 relative risk increase in smokers. Or for aneurysms, it was a 2.97. Or for gastric or duodenal ulcers, a 4.0. Look, however, at lung cancer, which I bolded and set off to the side here. We all hear the expression so often, smoking causes lung cancer. Look at the risk ratio here of that, 10.73. Over a tenfold increase in lung cancer incidence among smokers as compared to non-smokers. There, the relative risk is very high, sending us a strong suggestive signal that there might be some sort of causal relationship here. Although, as we'll see in a future lecture, that doesn't automatically allow us to suggest, just because the relative risk ratio is high, that we know causation occurs. Okay, so let me just back up a second, because in a previous lecture I gave you this quote from Richard Pito, the man who was investigating aspirin and heart attack incidents. In his paper, he says, quote, "There is simply no scientific alternative to the generation of large-scale randomized evidence." However, what he really meant in saying that was the following, that studies that have extreme relative risks in them may reliably be demonstrable of causation without large-scale randomization, but moderate relative risks may not be. In other words, if the risk is not that large, then you might need a higher quality study in order to measure it. But if it's a massive risk, then you might not need as high a quality to study in order to determine it. And this, in fact, was the case if we go back and look at the aspirin study again. What he says here, and here are the results on the left-hand side from that aspirin study, is number one, that if the ISIS-2 trial had been 10 times smaller, that is, only 1,700 in the population instead of 17,000, then exactly the same overall results in number one would not have been conventionally significant by a statistical measure. In other words, we wouldn't have been able to rule out these possibilities as mere chance. But number two, it also would have had much less effect on medical practice because people needed a higher quality study, one that was statistically significant and therefore needed to enroll so many people in an RCT in order to rule out chance, confounders, and bias. In the DDT case, such a high quality study was not as necessary because of the power of the relationship between the DDT and the incidence of malaria. Here's the preliminary conclusion on power. It depends on what method you need to know causation, depends on the strength of the causal relation in question. For exceptionally strong causal links, it's not usually necessary, as I've said in the case of malaria and DDT, to conduct a large-scaled RCT with lots of patients to get causal knowledge. Less precise forms of scientific study, or even just casual observation, may suffice. But for medium-sized causal effects, very powerful experimental design, carefully randomized large study populations, and controls that rule out chance and confounders and biases that have been put into place are necessary to isolate any true but weak or moderate causal effect from any chance or bias that might occur. I've run a little longer than intended today, so I'm going to make the next lecture the start off of the next lecture, our coverage of extrapolation, which is also a minor but important topic that we've talked about once before. We'll cover those few slides, and then we're going to move on to discussing the inferior design problems, but also attributes of observational studies. I'll see you in the next class, and be thinking about relative risk ratios. Are there risks for which the ratio is so high that it seems patently obvious? Conversely, are there some risks that you might take for granted where the relative risk ratio actually might seem to be lower, and therefore we might question whether in fact we need a stronger design experimentally in order to get that knowledge? I'll look forward to your comments on the chat boards. See you then.